Liberalism. Section. From the assertion of the principle of the, quote, uselessness of slavery among ourselves, to the condemnation of slavery as such. We are trying to answer the question we posed at the beginning. Can authors like Fletcher and Calhoun be considered liberals? In the liberal England derived from the Glorious Revolution, Fletcher could calmly demand the introduction of slavery for vagrants without being in any way isolated, just as Hutchinson and Burke, who expressed more or less similar positions, were not isolated. While Hutchinson was the master of Smith, Fletcher was in correspondence with Locke and enjoyed, along with Burke, the respect of Jefferson and the circles close to him. These were the years when, as Hume put it, quote, some passionate admirers of the ancients and zealous partisans of civil liberty cannot forbear regretting the loss of this institution, slavery, which accounted for the grandeur of Athens and Rome. End quote. However, with the establishment of the principle of the uselessness of slavery among ourselves, the positions expressed by Fletcher ceased to be accepted as liberal. It is true that they took a long time to die. As late as 1838, a German liberal reported the, quote, advice, certainly more hinted at than clearly stated, which would wish to find a remedy for the serious danger, represented by an unprecedented and acute social question, in the introduction of veritable slavery for factory workers. End quote. But it was a suggestion rejected with disdain. The line of demarcation of the Liberal Party had been drawn for a while. A similar argument can be advanced in connection with Calhoun. In his view, it was the North that was guilty of betraying the liberal principles which had inspired the American Revolution. In fact, quote, the defense of human liberty against the aggressions of despotic power had always been most efficient in states where domestic slavery was found to prevail. End quote. Within the Union, it was the South that had, quote, constantly inclined most strongly to the side of liberty, and had been the first to see and first to resist the encroachments of power. End quote. And it was in the South that liberalism found its most authentic and mature expression. The term liberal, warned John Randolph, sometimes defined as the American Burke, which originally meant, quote, a man attached to enlarged and free principles, a votary of liberty, would see its true meaning twisted if it had to be used to refer to those who flirted with abolitionism. A contemporary liberal might be tempted to be shot of the unmanageable presence within the tradition of thought he refers to of an author like Burke, who celebrated the particular intensity of the liberal spirit and love of liberty among slave owners, or of an author like Calhoun, who in the 19th century still hymned the, quote, positive good that was slavery. And so both of them are officially included in the Conservative Party. However, such an operation immediately reveals its groundlessness. The category of conservatism is characterized by formalism, in the sense that it can subsume significantly different contents. It is a question of identifying what it is intended to conserve or guard. And there is no doubt that Burke and Calhoun aimed to be vigilant guardians of the social relations and political institutions which emerged, respectively, from the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution, two eminently liberal revolutions. It would make no sense to regard Jefferson and Washington as liberals, but this is not the case with Burke, who, unlike them, was not a slave owner, and who, when he celebrated the, quote, liberal spirit and liberal emphasis of the slave-holding South, had in mind precisely figures like these two Virginian statesmen. As late as 1862, Lord Acton cited at length, and implicitly subscribed to, the passage by the British Whig, who, far from excluding slave owners, conferred on them a privileged position in the party of liberty. It would be just as illogical to exclude from that party Calhoun, who tirelessly reiterated his attachment to representative bodies and the principle of the limitation of power. If, then, going beyond the merely formal meaning of the term, conservatism is to be understood as an uncritical attachment to a pre-modern, pre-industrial society, characterized by the cult of clod of earth and bell tower, such a category could hardly account for Calhoun's positions. Once the rights of minorities had been guaranteed, he had no problem with extending the vote and even introducing male universal suffrage. And, along with representative bodies, he celebrated the development of manufactures, industry, and free trade. If to anyone, the category of conservatism might be applied to Jefferson. He identified cultivators of the land as, quote, the chosen people of God, assimilated, quote, great cities to the sores of a human body, and in 1812, during the war with Britain, accused the latter of being an instrument of Satan because it had compelled America to abandon the paradise of agriculture and engage in manufacturing in order to meet the test of arms. And the category of conservatism might also be applied to Washington. He too viewed with concern the prospect that the Americans might become a, quote, manufacturing people, rather than continuing to be cultivators of the land, thereby avoiding the scourge of the, quote, tumultuous populace of the large cities. In particular, it is against Jefferson that Calhoun seems to be arguing when he rejects the thesis that manufacture, quote, destroys the moral and physical power of the people. In reality, this was a concern rendered ever more obsolete by, quote, the great perfection of machinery introduced into industry. Finally, if acceptance of free trade is an integral part of liberalism, it is clear that Calhoun can be included in such a tradition much more easily than his adversaries in the North, who were engaged in strict protectionist practices, liable, according to the Southern theorists' denunciation, to, quote, destroy the liberty of the country. Construed in the broadest sense of the term, the Liberal Party encompassed both Whigs and Tories. The former did not even necessarily represent the more advanced wing. Josiah Tucker was a Tory, who reprehended Locke and Burke for being followers of a, quote, republicanism based precisely upon slavery and serfdom. For the rest, arguing with, quote, Republican zealots, he liked to position himself among the true interpreters of, quote, English constitutional liberty. Disraeli was likewise a Tory, who, while on the one hand echoing the arguments of the slaveholding South, on the other significantly widened the social basis of British representative bodies, granting the vote to significant sections of the popular classes, and anyway extending it much further than the Whigs had. On the other hand, outside the Liberal Party, even before the Civil War, were those who, in their concern to save the institution of slavery and indignation at the weapons supplied by representative bodies to an increasingly threatening abolitionist agitation, spoke with Fitzhugh in the southern United States of the, quote, collapse of liberal society, or ironized with Carlyle in Europe itself over ruinous, quote, anarchic constitutional epochs. Although reiterating the absolute necessity of slavery as the foundation of civilization, both ended up challenging, at least on a theoretical level, the ethnic and spatial delimitations of the institution of slavery. For Fitzhugh, as was demonstrated by the examples of classical antiquity and confirmed by the reality of the modern world, work was inseparable from slavery, so that in one form or another, slavery, black or white, was right and necessary. In justifying the slavery of the Afro-Americans across the Atlantic and branding the Irish black, Carlyle, admired by Fitzhugh and other Southerners, and in correspondence with some of them, in his turn reached a general conclusion, quote, whether established by law or by law abrogated, slavery exists very extensively in this world, in and out of the West Indies, and you cannot abolish slavery by act of Parliament, but can only abolish the name of it, which is very little. End quote. Whether dealing with slaves, servants hired for life, or adscripti glabae, it was still slavery. On the other hand, if the slave was a, quote, servant hired for life, why should one prefer the servant hired for a month or a day? Spurred by the bitterness of the struggle underway, Fitzhugh and Carlyle ultimately returned to the positions of Fletcher, first marginalized and then regarded as alien to the Liberal Party. The transition from the Liberal Party's first turn to the second can be summarized thus. Following the defeat of the South, the emancipation of black slaves, and amendments to the U.S. Constitution to that effect, a transition was made from asserting the principle of the, quote, uselessness of slavery among ourselves in Europe and the, quote, free states of the northern United States to general condemnation, on both sides of the Atlantic, of slavery as such. Starting from this second result, the positions expressed by Calhoun were also rejected by the Liberal Party. But that is not a reason to expel him retrospectively from the liberal tradition. Otherwise, the same fate would have to be meted out to Locke and a fair number of the protagonists of the American Revolution in the early decades of U.S. history. In any event, with the end of the Civil War, a historical cycle came to a close, having emerged together from a unique twin birth, which saw them entwined in a relationship not without its tensions. Liberalism as a whole now broke with slavery in the strict sense, with hereditary racial slavery. But before examining these new courses, it is appropriate to extend our analysis of the society that was established on the two Atlantic shores up to the Civil War. We have hitherto focused attention on the problem of black slavery. But what about relations that were developing within the white community? End section.